After 6 years out of the limelight, back comes county cricket. This month sees the Great Awakening. Best known name is Gloucester's Wally Hammond. Coming out at Bristol, nobody since W.G. Grace has skippered a test side at the age of 43. But batsman Hammond looks like smashing the precedent this year. The big names of season 1946 are still in the mystery bag. But one that's sure to come out is Gloucester and England skipper Wally Hammond.
It was here in 1946, on the county ground in Bristol, that Walter Hammond, one of the greatest cricketers of all time, prepared for his last season with Gloucestershire. It was a glittering career. 50,000 runs, 167 hundreds, 732 wickets, 819 catches. His 85 test matches and 7,000 runs plus for England were records then that nobody else had surpassed. But these all-round figures, marvellous though they are, tell only half the story. Neville Carter suggested you might just as well count the notes of Beethoven or take the measurements of the Elgin marbles. R.C. Robertson Glasgow wrote that he enriched the game with a grace, simplicity and nobility that may never be seen again. And Carter again, he averred that his place in the permanent National Gallery of Cricketers is safe, not as a painting, but a nobly looming sculpture. Walter Hammond was a man of complex character. He could be distant, aloof, sometimes intolerant. There were differing views about his qualities as a captain, but of his shining qualities as a cricketer, there can never be the slightest doubt.
Hammond batting, a brilliant innings on the second morning. Lovely cuts, but it went straight to the fielder. The second morning, Hammond, 48 not out. There's his 50, I think, yes. He's got 2 to leg. A beautiful hook shot. Hammond batting. There you go. He must be stumped. No, he got back just in time. The ball came slowly off the wicket. James did it as quickly as he could. There's his 100. Hammond gets 100 on the second morning.
When you hear chaps like Herbert Sutcliffe and Maurice Leyland, Hedley Verity and these fellows talking about the way he used to talk about Wally, you can be pretty sure that this chap has got something. And he certainly had. For a young player, I would say, you watch Wally. And this is the chap to watch, and he'll show you how to bat.
I'd never seen anyone hit the ball with so much power and in the same way have so much presence on the field. It was almost, you know, the entry of the gladiator. When he walked on the field, everything suddenly stopped and you knew you were in the presence of a great man.
If you remember Frank Chester, the old umpire, he once said to me, when this chap comes out to bat, all that's necessary is the red carpet. He just took command of the place. He'd come out to bat perfectly attired, a blue handkerchief stuck out of his pocket. You never saw Wally Scruffy, ever. He was immaculate, just like his batting.
The most glorious physique that I've ever seen. He had beautiful shoulders, small hips, and, of course, blessed with wonderful brown eyes, which meant that he could see very, very much better than most people.
Very keen on golf and quite a good golfer. I think at one time he played down to about 6, which is pretty good for any cricketer. But he was a good dresser, there's no question about that. He was a good-looking fellow.
He liked fast cars and fast driving, and I liked going fast, so it didn't worry me. He always knew I was there. We'd choose where we wanted to sit, and he'd very soon find and wave, and he'd look occasionally.
Hammond, Vos and Jardine fielding in the slips to Allen?
I would have difficulty in naming a greater slip catcher than Walter Hammond. When he used to catch this ball that at times was travelling very quick, you'd rather feel he was catching a tennis ball, not a hard cricket ball. It seemed to go into his pretty big hands without any noise, without any bang and all this sort of thing. He had this great knack of drawing the ball towards him with relaxed forearms and so on.
He was the greatest slip fielder in my time, without any doubt at all. And I would go further and say I think he's probably at least one of the greatest there's ever been. I won't say that he's any better than Botham, because I think Botham is a magnificent slip fielder, because he stands at 2 yards a little closer than most, even closer than Wally did. But Wally was one of the greatest I ever saw.
He was always in position, and he was a big man, tremendous man. I remember keeping wicket once or twice, and I used to stand up to George Lambert now and again on a really good Bristol wicket. And if I deflect one, Wally would be going one way, and he'd just come the other way and catch it and throw it back. Just chuck it back. And I'd say nothing, just throw it back. But he was built like a heavyweight, and he moved like a fly. It was marvellous to watch him just move.
Oh, yes, and he had a beautiful action, too, a beautiful sideways on action. A few of the moderns might have a look at him now, because he's a beautiful athlete. I maintain that if he'd not been a batsman of any class at all and had worked on his bowling, he certainly would have played for England as a bowler, in my opinion. He was nippy, and he bustled off the ground, but people don't all do, and he moved the ball. He could make the ball move. People used to say he could bowl off spinners, but I don't think he really could, but he was a darn good seamer.
And he was quicker than Botham would have been. So he was a really fast, medium bowler, I suppose. But really, if he'd bowled, he could have been the complete cricketer. I don't see how anybody could ever play cricket better than Wally in the 3 dimensions of the game, really.
Walter Reginald Hammond was born in Dover on June the 19th, 1903. He spent some early years in Hong Kong and Malta, his father being a regular soldier in the Royal Artillery who moved through the ranks to become a major. He was killed in action in 1918. His mother was a forceful personality. When her husband went off to war in 1914, she was living in Southsea, and Walter was sent as a day boy to Portsmouth Grammar School. He wasn't enthusiastic about work, but what happened on the cricket and football fields was quite a different matter. His aptitude as a games player was evident very early on. In 1918, shortly before Major Hammond's death in France, his mother decided that Walter should go as a boarder to Cirencester Grammar School here in Gloucestershire. These days it's known as the County Junior School. He went straight into the first 11, and the following year, aged 16, when he was captain, he made 365 not out in a house match in under 2 hours. In August 1920, just 17 and just after leaving school, he made naught for Gloucestershire against Lancashire on his first-class debut. But the county knew they had a young player of exceptional promise on their hands. Gloucestershire signed Hammond as a professional cricketer for the season of 1921, when he played twice against the Australians. In the first match at Bristol, he made 1. In the second, naught, his stumps sent cartwheeling by Jack Gregory, and 1 again. 5 years later, he was to get his revenge against the other great Australian fast bowler of the 20s, Ted MacDonald, when MacDonald was playing for Lancashire. He simply murdered him with 187 at Old Trafford. Now, those 2 innings he played against the Australians in 1921 were his only ones for Gloucestershire that season. It hadn't been lost on Kent that by virtue of his birth in Dover, young Walter was qualified to play for them. Their protests were sent to Lords and to MCC, then the fount of all authority and wisdom in the first-class game. Their case was forcibly argued by Lord Harris in the foreground here, a former captain of Kent and England who exerted a profound influence on cricket for half a century. Hammond was made to serve a 2-year qualification for Gloucestershire before he could play in the county championship. So in 1921, he took a job at Clifton College as assistant coach to the old Yorkshire cricketer John Tunnicliffe, and he earned himself some extra money in the winter by playing professional soccer for Bristol Rovers. Joe Walter, then a regular outstanding member of the Rovers side, remembers the old alliance well.
Oh, he was quite a good footballer. Yeah. We got on well together as a right wing. I played outside and he played inside, and we got on well together. I don't think he was ever a great goal-getter. and he'd avoid a heavy tackle or anything like that. But he was skillful player, and he kept out of trouble as regards injury. He'd never wear the ordinary shin pads. He used to have a pair of cricket leg guards, you know. He cut the tops off and put his stockings up over. Of course, his legs were all out here, and we used to really laugh about it. But he told them straight he wouldn't take any risk. He didn't want to be injured in playing football. He was a good cricketer, and that was his ambition. I don't think he cared much about football. He used to like to play, but I don't think he was all that. He didn't have his heart in football like he did cricket.
Once Hammond was qualified to play regularly for Gloucestershire, he lost little time in making his mark. In his first full season, 1923, he hit 110 and 92 against Surrey, and more than 1,400 runs all told. In 1924, a remarkable big 100 on a turning pitch against Middlesex at Bristol. And then, early in 27, he set the cricket world ablaze with 1,000 runs in May. W.G. Grace may have been the founding father of Gloucestershire cricket, but Hammond was now its favourite son. All of Hammond's 1,000 runs in May 1927 were made for Gloucestershire, and the county did him proud. Some compensation, no doubt, for his ill luck in West Indies 2 winters earlier. At the end of his first England tour, he contracted such a serious infection that he missed the whole of the following summer. Back home in 1928 at the Cheltenham Festival, Hammond enjoyed 6 days of quite astounding all-round success. Against Surrey, he made 139 and 143. He held 9 catches in the first innings, held the last batsman off Charlie Parker's bowling. Against Worcestershire, he took 9 wickets for 23, 6 for 105, relative failure with the bat, only 80. And then chosen as a member of Percy Chapman's MCC side to Australia in 1928-29, he was even closer to greater fame.
I think he got something like 900 runs. I remember I saw his innings, of course, and after the first test in which he didn't get very many runs, I think he got 44, 28, something like that, both innings. And then he went to Sydney and played a magnificent innings of 251 or 250. Then went on to Melbourne and got another double century, 200. And I think he was run out the second innings with about 40 going again. Then on to Adelaide, and he got 100 in each innings. And then back to Melbourne, where he relatively failed. I think he only got 40 and 20 or something like that. And Australia won the only match of that series, where he won under Percy Chapman 4-1.
Shortly after his triumphant return from Australia, Walter Hammond went to Yorkshire to marry Dorothy Lister, the daughter of a Bradford textile merchant. He'd met her 2 years earlier at the Scarborough Festival. The wedding was at Bingley Parish Church, and the bridegroom now being a national hero, it was quite a do. The wool mill shut down, the traffic snarled up, Pathé newsreel cameras caught the action for the cinema screens. Prime Minister Baldwin sent a telegram to the happy couple. But it was a union cynically but perhaps truthfully described as being one between fame and brass. After a short honeymoon in Europe, Walter and Dorothy Hammond lived in this house which he had built for him at Fayland near Bristol. In fact, he planted the 2 yew trees behind me. He seemed now established as the greatest, most exciting run maker in the game. But was he? On that England tour in 1928-29, a young man called Don Bradman made his test match bow with 200s. When Australia returned to England in 1930 to win back the Ashes, this phenomenal run-getter was to make 974 runs in the Test series, including a record innings of 334 at Headingley, 309 of them in one day.
Well, I suppose my predominant memory is what a great player he was, because without any shadow of doubt, Wally would be one of the greatest all-round cricketers who ever played. And my first contact with him was in 1928, and in the very first match, he made a double century, and that was a pretty good introduction.
That was the series when he made 905 runs.
Yes, but I'm talking about the time he played against New South Wales, not in a test match. He made 200 odd against New South Wales, and incidentally, we didn't get him out, we had to run him out.
England went back to Australia in 1932-33 for a test series never to be forgotten. How, under Douglas Jardine's captaincy, could they hope to curb the unprecedented talents of the Don?
D.R. Jardine, the captain, is England's steadiest bat and ought to be a tower of strength in the test matches. Wally Hammond, mainstay of Gloucestershire, and on his day the world's most prolific run-getter, not excluding Australia's own Donald Bradman. Leslie Ames, who went down under with the last test tourist as deputy wicketkeeper, but has proved this season that he is one of the world's premier batsmen.
You know, your views on bodyline are well known. What did Wally Hammond think about the bodyline tactics?
Well, none of us said too much about it at the time, but Wally was like myself. He was not in favour of it. We didn't think it was quite the right way to play cricket. But everyone, of course, and quite rightly so, were loyal to the Captain Jardine, and so we went along with it. You see, it was a very different world in those days. I mean, had we demonstrated rather strongly that we were against it, I don't think we would have got very far. I won't say more than that. Hammond hits a 6, and the last stroke has been played in the 1932-33 Test matches. When the MCC sailed for Australia, who would have predicted that England would win 4 out of the 5 tests, making the total victories 51 each? Who would have given Bradman an average of only 56 runs an innings? The Australian crowds have been outspoken in their criticism of the leg theory. But let us hope that Larwood will not persist in his intention never to play in Australia again. His leg theory bowling has been the subject of bitter controversy. But if his success with express deliveries has the effect of encouraging strong young bowlers to put their faith in speed, cricket generally should benefit. The biggest factor in England's triumph has been Larwood's mastery of Bradman, and he got him again in the final test, when the young wizard had scored 48 out of 64.
How do you think he reacted to the short, fast stuff?
I think the same as everybody else. He didn't like it, and in fact I believe he said that if he had had to face that sort of stuff as he did against the West Indies, you remember, one time, he would rather get out of the game.
Hit on the jaw by a rising ball, Hammond had to retire, but returned with his face covered with sticking plaster to continue his innings. Leary Constantine trundled them down to Jardine, bowling to a leg field. Jardine took his own medicine and liked it. He came in when 3 wickets were down for 118 and stayed for the rest of the second day. There were drinks.
And there were crowds. The English public was soon queuing up again to watch Australia and Bradman back in England in 1934 to win back the Ashes. Wally Hammond, by his own high standards, had an indifferent series, but the public interest was immense. His great Australian rival held centre stage again. In the Test matches, Bradman made another 300 at Headingley and a little matter of 244 at the Oval. This was the season when Gloucestershire gave Hammond a benefit. It produced an impressive £3,000. Who says it's only these days that crowds invade the ground? Lord's 1934, after Headley Verity had taken 14 Australian wickets in a day.
I have a feeling somehow that neither Don nor Walter liked each other very much. Whether it was the jealousy each had of their own ability, I just don't know. But I'm certain that Walter made, I think, 336 against New Zealand in a Test match, simply because Don made 334 against England at Leeds in 1930. How these rivalries build up, I'm not quite sure, but I always felt that Walter did not have a great deal of love for Don Bradman. Both magnificent batsmen. Personally, I would like to see just an hour of Walter Hammond rather than 8 or 10 hours of Don Bradman.
Wally Hammond, one of the outstanding personalities in the cricketing world, tried and true. Now back to Test form, he should be there when the Ashes are recaptured.
Having completed his 100th 100 in 1935 in only a dozen seasons, Hammond toured Australia again under Gubby Allen in 36-37. England won the first 2 tests, Australia the next 3 to retain the Ashes. Then back home, New Zealand.
Thousands are attracted to Lord's to see the first test with New Zealand. Robbins, England's new captain, winning the toss from Page, decides to bat. Cowie, bowling fast, is soon rewarded for his strenuous efforts when Hutton, playing in his first test at the age of 21, is defeated. Hardstaff comes to the rescue with a score of 31 for 2 and settles down to a fine partnership with that stalwart Wally Hammond. The stand produces some arresting cricket. Hammond passes Hardstaff and scores his century.
The great surprise to me, and I'd hero worship all these people, including Wally, from that high upwards. And all of a sudden, I was on the field with them, and I find Wally and the others were calling me Mr. Parker, aged 18, which was a bit much. But of course, I was an amateur. And in those days, the amateurs were always Mr., you see. And Wally was Hammond, W.R., Parker, Charlie, and Red Sinfield, and the rest of them were all Sinfield and Goddard and Parker and Hammond, and I was Mr. Parker. So would you move over there, Mr. Parker, please? That sort of thing, which was a completely different world.
As a county professional, Hammond was paid about £400 a year, although, of course, by putting his famous name on a bat was one way of increasing his modest income. And then in 1937, he was offered and accepted a directorship with Marsham Tyres at the then enviable salary of £2,000 a year. This brought him financial independence, the opportunity to turn amateur, to captain his country and his county, and pressures of a different sort. In 1938, Walter Hammond, now an amateur, led the gentlemen against the players and was appointed England's captain against Bradman's Australians. It was a head-to-head confrontation between the two great players. Hammond got a modest 26 in the first test at Nottingham when 4 England batsmen scored hundreds before a superb 232 by Stan McCabe ensured Australia a draw. And so to Lord's for the second test, where Hammond made 240, an innings still spoken of with awe by those lucky enough to see it.
I think it was the greatest innings ever played. One of the greatest innings ever played. He didn't make a mistake. And his driving through the covers was magnificent.
Oh, it was a magnificent innings. You had to see it to believe it. He never put a foot wrong, never gave the seventh a chance, and he hit Bill O'Reilly all over the place. He didn't know where to bowl at him. I was the lucky one who bowled the particular type of stuff that slowed up his offside shots, and he had no real battery anywhere between square leg and fine leg. A magnificent on-driver, which I reckon is the best shot in the game. If I bowl and the man hits me strongly past mid-off, wide of mid-off, I say, look out, here's a day's work here ahead of me. He can do that, he can do it all day long. But as soon as you got him round towards square leg, you rather bound him up a bit. And when I say that, I bound the great Walter Hammond up. I did, in other words, I slowed him down just a little.
Kent were bowled out twice at Bristol in a day, and by Tom Goddard mainly. Tom took 15 wickets, and he was lauding it a little bit in the dressing room, Tom Goddard. And Wally said, hang on a minute, you're not quite as good a bowler as you think. I reckon you were bowling against some pretty poor players there. He said, come on, we'll go out in the middle and have a little bowl. And Wally took a brand new bat. The rest of the players went out. Took a brand new bat, turned it sideways, and played Tom Goddard on the same wicket with the edge for 20 minutes. Well, that's unbelievable, really. Well, it is to me. I didn't mind playing on turners, but I mean, to be that good, and I think this is where he was known as the greatest ever player on a dry turner. But to play Tom Goddard, who was a magnificent bowler, with the edge of the bat for 20 minutes is unbelievable.
Hammond made 1500s and more than 3,000 runs in 1938, heading the national batting averages for a 7th season in a row. But Australia retained the Ashes after a drawn Test match series in which Len Hutton made that record monumental 364 at the Oval. Before the season was over, Hammond was named as captain in South Africa the following winter, the last tour England made before the Second World War.
In South Africa, Mr. Hammond and his men get some fun and games between Test matches. They pay a visit, for instance, to the Crown Mines, where a team of Zulu fans turn out for their special benefit. They'd probably make excellent cricketers if properly trained. Zulu tactics would certainly brighten up the game. Some of these boys have already acquired the correct stance for an umpire.
I found him a very good captain. I had no complaints at all. And when we went to South Africa, the last tour that I did before the war, we had a very successful tour out there. We were never defeated the whole series, and he captained the side beautifully.
Although he always fielded at first slip, he was the best first slip we had in England. I always felt that if I ever should be captain of England, I would not field at first slip. I think it's a difficult position to captain a team from, being at first slip. But I enjoyed playing under him. What he did say to me, he didn't say a lot, but what I did say, I enjoyed and appreciated very much.
He couldn't ask anybody. His father was a sergeant, and his father had to do that which the sergeant major wanted correctly, and they could not ask questions. And a sergeant doesn't say, please. So Wally never learnt the art of asking anybody. He could tell them. And he frightened the life out of the young fast bowlers of Gloucestershire. Lambert and Scott, they just could not bowl because he stood there in the first slip and glared at them. He was a bad captain.
I don't think Wally liked Charlie Barnett, and I don't think Charlie Barnett liked Wally. But I think that Charlie Barnett was the first to recognize the greatness of Wally. I think he realized that Wally was a very great player.
Oh, no, you couldn't fault him. You couldn't fault the man. Except that he was a bit of a loner. And I think also he was a lonely man, which is another different thing altogether. To give an example, he was a very great friend of Billy Neal's at school together. And when he was captain of England and the pressure was on, he would come down to the farm. Billy Farm was a farm on Breadstone Farm near Berkeley. And Wally would come down and stay there, and I'd often see him in the morning. He'd go out in Billy's orchards with his hands in his pockets, head down, going backwards and forwards, keeping away from me, just sorting out his problems. So I always thought that many of the decisions he made in Test matches were first made and originated in those orchards at Berkeley. He was difficult. When you say he was difficult, he was very much a loner. He didn't say anything. Very little.
Hammond was commissioned as a pilot officer in the RAF in October '39 after one last Test series against the West Indies before the war. He was a tough disciplinarian, training young air crews in Hastings and Torquay. He was soon posted to Cairo as sports and entertainments officer. Back home again in 1944, he starred in some wartime one-day games at Lord's, and then in '45, he led England in the hugely popular victory tests against Australia. But he was troubled now by some painful fibrositis, and for many years his marriage to Dorothy had been under stress.
Whenever there was a plane coming from his station, which was Torquay or Bexhill, he was on it, and we'd get a telephone message from the station, please meet him at Filton. Sometimes he came by car when he had enough petrol, and we used to go around a bit. But he used to say, let's go home now and walk the dogs. We had an Alsatian and a Bull Terrier, and he was happiest, really, walking with the dogs and pottering in the garden, doing things with Father.
There was obviously a strong emotional tie between both of you. Do you have any mementos of your time together?
Yes, he gave me a Wings brooch. He said, I know you don't like rings, so I've bought this for you, but you'll have to wear my ring when we're married.
And you never did?
I never did.
After 6 years out of the limelight, back comes county cricket. This month sees the Great Awakening. Best known name is Gloucester's Wally Hammond.
We're all optimistic and looking forward to the coming season with keen pleasure. In common with other counties, we hope to do very well indeed and end up somewhere at the top of the table, if not at the top. The prospects for cricket generally, I think, in this country are good, and I think the MCC were very wise to have the Indians here so soon after the war.
Alec Bedser and Vijay Hazare, a test series against India. And Hammond, as England captain again, presented his side to King George VI, making a traditional visit to Lord's. He had a resounding last season for Gloucestershire, 7 centuries and an average of 104, and there could be no doubt who should lead England again in Australia.
What? I can hold it up. Can I say, what's this I've got hold of?
No shortage of class batsmen in the side, Hutton, Washbrook, Bill Edrich, Compton, Hammond, but the bowling leaned heavily on Alec Bedser and the Kent leg spinner Doug Wright.
Well, we've all considered ourselves very lucky to be going to Australia. We've got a grand lot of boys to go with. Some of us have been, a few of us, and we're looking forward to meeting old acquaintances and friends again. Those that haven't been can look forward to a wonderful trip. I'm sure you'd like to be introduced to them. Come on, Norman. This is Yardley of Yorkshire. Edrich of Middlesex. Smith of Essex. Washbrook of Lancashire. Aiken of Lancashire. Vose of Nottinghamshire. Pollard of Lancashire. Evans of Kent. Dennis Compton of the Arsenal and Middlesex. Joe Hardstaff of Nottingham. Alec Bedser of Surrey. Laurie Fishlock of Surrey. And Jim Langridge of Sussex.
Next stage brings in the Stirling Castle and the gangplank at Southampton. 17 men carrying England's cricket colours in Australia. Coming back, we hope they'll bring those famous Ashes.
We were just going out there to get beaten, I thought. I took the view at that time that it was too early to send a side at all to Australia. And I think if we'd waited 12 months...
English cricket wasn't ready by then?
No, I didn't think so. But I don't know who else could have taken the side at that time.
First pictures of the arrival at Fremantle of the MCC team aboard the Stirling Castle. I expect you'll recognize most of them. You'll certainly envy them the sunshine they're so obviously enjoying.
I had this feeling on the way to Australia that this was Walter's farewell tour. And after this tour, we wouldn't see very much of Walter Hammond.
We know their potentialities fairly well, but we know little of their opponents, nor whether Bradman will be playing.
We got a reasonable sort of start in Perth, but I think where we slipped up quite a bit was our relations with the press. And in this respect, I don't think Walter was very good. By nature, he was a rather introspective type of individual. And whilst I would say that he did not dislike the press, he did not help the press a great deal. And I felt after a few weeks, the press, particularly the Australian press, were really hitting us pretty hard. And the harder they hit us, the more Walter went into his shell.
I was sorry he came in 1946 because he rather let me down bad in 1946 in this way, that I had spoken of him with such tremendous admiration that when he came out here and the kids to whom I'd been speaking about him saw him, they finished up not thinking that Walter Hammond had ever been a great player. And I think lots of people enjoy the stage just a little bit too long, but he did the right thing. He was helping England out of the hole that they were in after the war, and he came and he sacrificed himself by doing that.
He didn't have very good health, you know, when he came to Australia on that tour, and finally didn't play in the last test of the series. But you've got to remember there was great pressure at that time to get cricket going again after the war, and I think Wally felt that pressure and responded to it to get the game going again. So we shouldn't blame him for that.
Hutton, the record breaker, was out for 7. Washbrook, a sterling opening batsman, made 6. Though Compton was next to be sent back, he hung on to make a grim 17. And Edridge too, though he made 1 less, put up a great defence for a long time. Aikin failed to contribute any runs, and what with the rain and the rout, the greatest credit must go to Yardley and Hammond for their very stout effort.
I know they still talk about it in Brisbane in '46 when he got 30 on one of the Australian lifters, where you really can't bat because the ball just takes a piece out of you, takes a piece out of the wicket, goes straight up past your nose. Anything that's really pitched up, they swing at. And Wally got 30 odd on there, and they still talk about that.
More film of the first test at Brisbane has now been flown home, so here are impressions of that rather disastrous event. Don and Wally inspect the pitch after the terrific storm. No wonder our batsmen, this is Edridge, were hemmed in by such a close field. The wicket was really almost unplayable. Edridge was hit in various parts of his person by express deliveries from Lindwall. No one should blame the bowlers, it was the wicket, and it was the same with Miller, who hit Washbrook on the head. But really, what a pitch. No wonder Hammond did a lot of gardening. Miller was the Australian star of the innings with 7 for 60. Hammond was the MCC's top scorer. His 32 was a really fine effort in the circumstances. He was eventually LBW bowled Toshak, who clean bowled him in the second innings for 23. When Bedser was caught and bowled Toshak for 18, the innings and the first test came to an end. All that remained was to examine this most remarkable of wickets and to look forward to test match number 2 at Sydney.
At the end of the match, Walter said to Cyril Washbrook and myself, would you like to come back to Sydney with me? And we'll go by road. So we said, yes, all right. Cyril and myself drove with Walter from Brisbane to Sydney, which is around about 700 miles. In a very good 3.5 litre car. We left Brisbane at around 5 o'clock in the evening and arrived at Sydney sort of 7:30, 8 o'clock next morning. So it was 700 miles, fairly rough, the roads and this sort of thing. Walter drove all the way, and all I can remember him saying on this journey was, keep your eyes open for where we can get some petrol. But I felt on this journey that here was a man sort of at the end of the road with a lot of problems. And the problems were not only associated with cricket. I think his domestic life was probably worrying him also at that particular time.
Walter Hammond first met Sybil Ness Harvey, a former beauty queen, when he led England in South Africa in 38-39. His wartime leaves in Durban strengthened the relationship, and he brought her to England in 1946. The fact was, his marriage to Dorothy had long been on the rocks.
In 1939, after she went to South Africa to try and patch it, they never could make a go of it. And he asked her lots of times if she would divorce him, and she wouldn't. And eventually she said she would and cite me, and he wouldn't have that. I said, well, that's silly, Wally, because we want to get married. You might just as well take your opportunity. And then during 1940, she said she would. And then he went abroad, and you can't divorce a serviceman who's abroad during wartime.
Of course, when he brought another woman to the village of where Dorothy's house was, when he had another woman in there, that was the end. My wife said, that's finished. And he never got in our house again after that.
That was his second wife, Sybil.
Yeah. Well, I don't know who it would be at the time. It was Sybil, actually, but I mean, when a man's casual and the wife is still around, I don't think it's just for she's lost her money. I don't think that goes down very well in Gloucestershire. We don't like that sort of thing.
Dorothy's lawyers had given notice of divorce proceedings before he sailed for Australia. He married Sybil the day after his return from the Australian tour at Kingston-on-Thames, and they set up home just outside Stroud. Bradman was back here in '48 to captain an immensely strong Australian side, Ray Linwall, Keith Miller and all. It won the Test Series 4-0. Hammond's career was now finished.
An early engagement was a luncheon at the Savoy given by the British Sportsman's Club, and among famous cricketers present were 3 English captains, Bob Wyatt, Percy Chapman, Wally Hammond. Jack Hobbs was one of the great old-timers there. Maurice Tate was another. Don Bradman scored a number of boundaries in the course of his speech.
But we are pleased to see the movie cameras for one very special reason. Because of the functions which have been arranged for us, we haven't got time to write to our wives. So we've informed them all that they must go to the newsreel once a week, and there they can see for themselves just how we're getting along.
In those days, the Australians traditionally played their first county match at Worcester, where on 3 tours in the 30s, Don Bradman got an early taste of runs with a double hundred or more. On this occasion, when his old rival Hammond was an observer in the press box, he contented himself with a modest 107.
Jackson to Bradman. The great Don tries to hit him for 6, but plays on. There's a shot for you, by the cameraman, I mean. It's certainly good to have cricket, the Aussies and Bradman with us again.
Hammond was persuaded to make one last appearance for Gloucestershire. It was against Somerset in the August bank holiday fixture of 1951 when he was 48. It was an emotive occasion, but it was a sad one. He really struggled to make 7 before he was bowled by Horace Hazell. His second wife, Sybil, was now yearning to go back to her native South Africa, and Walter Hammond had always enjoyed his visits there. So he now resigned his directorship with Marsh and Tyres, and they emigrated to Durban with their young son, Roger, and his little sister, Carolyn. Another girl, Valerie, was to arrive in 1952. So new horizons beckoned. A new life for a while seemed happy and exciting. But after investing almost all his savings in another tyres business, the enterprise turned sour. And then, in due course, he became general manager of a company selling motor cars. That failed as well. So in 1959, age 56, Walter Hammond was out of a job and up against it.
When his motor car business went bankrupt, he was without a job and had fallen on hard times. And Owen Horwood, who was then the professor of economics at Natal University, decided to offer him a job as sports administrator, as superior groundsman, as coach. And I happened to be captain of the university cricket team at that stage. And that's really how I got to meet him, because Wally, in fact, came along and coached us on a few occasions. It was amazing that this man, who'd evoked all sorts of comment from the greatest cricketing writers in the country or around the world, he was always described, as you know, as the Oak of England, as majestic and a man of considerable grandeur. And here he was walking the fields at Natal University.
Until the day in 1960 when he was gravely injured in a car accident.
He had to avoid a lorry, and he rolled several times and was literally left for dead. He was severely injured, there's no doubt about that. And he had to be nursed back to health. And the Wally Hammond I saw when I got back to South Africa from this country was a different Wally, I think. He wasn't quite as strong and as active as he used to be.
Only 2 years after that car crash, Hammond was back in Bristol to help his old county with a drive for new membership, invited home by the then chairman, Sir Percy Lister.
Have you thrown off the effects of your car accident of a couple of years ago?
Oh, yes, I hope so, anyway.
Well, you're looking
I'm feeling very well indeed.
Well, we read at the time that you were almost dying. I see you've come back, as it were, to save Gloucestershire cricket from dying.
Oh, we'll try our best.
What made you come back, actually, though, Wally?
Oh, I've come back for a little leave and also tried to help the county with their campaign, which I'm very interested to see do well because I think it's most essential.
We've stacks of young players now, Wally, who can keep a straight bat and put their left shoulder well into the line of the ball. But it seems to develop too many negative players. Do you think possibly that there's too much coaching?
I don't think I blame coaching. I think a great deal of the coaching that is given depends on the age of the person that you give it to. And I'm a great believer in all ages of trying to coach people with in their own natural attribute that they may have, not to coach them in something that is foreign to them.
Did you have much coaching yourself?
Yes, I had a little, yes.
Well, of course, you were famous for your cover drive off the back or the front foot, but the sweep, I suppose that's possibly the most exciting of your shots.
Oh, yes, that's something Sir Percy here taught me.
He went back to South Africa and towards the end of 1964 played for a press 11 that included his old England colleague Dennis Compton. It was during England's last tour of South Africa under M.J.K. Smith, when Gubby Allen was an observer.
Yes, I went to South Africa in 64-5, partly on business, partly to watch the cricket. And when I got to Durban, I got in touch with Wally, and he came and had dinner with me. He was a sad man then. He never really recovered from his motor accident. He chatted away, and we had a jolly nice evening, but it wasn't the Wally I'd known before, which for me was very sad. And of course he did in fact die a few months later.
Flanked by Dennis Compton and Donald Carr, later secretary of the Test and County Cricket Board, this is the last picture of Walter Hammond at a cricket match, the old elegant blue trademark still revealed. Within a few months he was dead, struck down by a heart attack, aged 62. His ashes were scattered here on his old county ground, the scene of so many of his triumphs. The Hammond Room perpetuates his fame at Bristol at the county ground, and 6,000 miles away in South Africa, in Durban, the University of Natal has ensured that his name will be remembered there. Shortly after his death, a host of cricketers from home and abroad gathered in Bristol Cathedral for a memorial service. His mother, who outlived him by 5 years, was there. Back in South Africa, Sybil and her 3 children, times were hard. He'd made no provision for his family. A trust fund was established to help tide them over their difficulties. And sadly, most, if not all, of Walter's trophies and mementos were sent back to England to be sold off at a public auction. Let those of us who were privileged to see Walter Hammond play remember him in his prime. And let those who played with and against him have the last word.
I would say Wally was one of the greatest players who ever lived, greatest all-round players who ever lived, and he was certainly the best player on the offside that I ever saw.
Although I played with a lot of very great players like Len Hutton and Dennis Compton, people like that, no one had the same enormous presence that Wally did.
Very finest of all batsmen against slow bowling. Better even than the great Don. He was certainly the finest player of slow bowling in the world.
I'm glad I knew him and glad I played with him. I never had a wrong word or any sort of dissension in my cricketing associations with Walter Hammond. He was the best cricketer that I played with and against. And I only wish that we had a player of his class playing in world cricket today.